So I am back continuing the series of Inquisitorial Thoughts. This is episode 6, and today's episode will be the what if of wargaming. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about a concept, it's fairly common sense, but I just thought it would be a neat subject just to generate some discussion. And that is how we play war games that come from various backgrounds, and there's uncertainty in the results, and sometimes that can actually conflict with the very background of the game itself. Now, I call this the what if of wargaming because many of you may be aware of there is a comic series by Marvel that has been released over the years for a very long time. It's done a number of volumes. I haven't read one in a while, but as I understand, it's even within the last couple of years they've released issues called What If, and basically it's sort of like, what if something happened within the history of the comics differently, and how would the results be? And so one of them might be, what if Thor was Galactus's herald, rather than Silver Surfer, kind of took the place of Silver Surfer, and what would that mean? And then they would just have a whole comic about it, and just sort of, it's a bit of a conflict within the background of the genre, and it allows just some more freedom within storytelling and just about think of things differently. So when I think of this for wargaming, basically, you can apply this to really anything. I mean, you can take 40K, and when you play your games, you might notice that a lot of the lore is based on Space Marines. And Space Marines, for the most part, somebody's going to come in and correct me, but for the most part, they mostly win. If you look at the Horus Heresy, it was about coming right off of the Crusades, which were basically humanity taking back space. And as part of that, they mainly won. They may have lost battles and taken losses and things, but they mainly won and took back after... I don't know if they called it Old Night, but it was basically a period of time where humanity lost communication with each other. They basically came back and had these crusades and took back, their planets and away from Xenos and aliens and everything. And so a lot of times they're portrayed as winning, and they're the sort of humanity is in the literature, in the books. They're trying to get you to identify with the humanity and the characters. You're not identifying, they're not trying to get you to identify with Tyranids like aliens, that are just sort of mostly mindless, eating machines, Now, when you play 40K and across the various iterations over time, of course there have been differences in balance among the various codexes, but there were times when, even since I've returned to playing, and I don't think it's the case as much now, but there were times when people never wanted to play generic Space Marines because they always felt they lost. They just didn't. They didn't consider them even mid-tier, at a certain point. Now that changes all the time, but I'm going to freeze that and use that as an example, because if you read the books quite a bit, and your experience is these heroic Space Marines that come in and are, deadly and, winning. But then if you're playing with your Space Marines game after game and losing, and particularly maybe to the same things that they beat in the book, you might feel a bit of a conflict. Now, part of this will really depend on what your approach to gaming is, because if your approach to gaming is purely mathematical and just very much literal on a competitive standpoint, you're maybe not even seeing models in an imaginatory way, you're not seeing models as more than what they represent and what their capabilities are at that moment in the game. For others, you see the models and they represent something greater to you, and you might have a conflict in that. Now, this can actually apply to history as well. There are countless examples, but you can take any famous battle in history and say that you're running this battle. It could be something from World War II, it could be something back to Roman times, it could be anything. And then, let's say you do the battle and then it just goes really, really against what happened in history and what you're familiar with. And let's say you even recreate it again, and then it happens again, and you're just finding it very difficult to even achieve the result that happened in history. Some people might get a little turned off by that, and they might even say, well, like, this faction is supposed to be, this, and how come it doesn't represent that at all? And so what I think to a degree can come down to is balance and simulation. Do we want the games to be balanced and represent for two competitive human players to play and feel like they both have an equal shot, and it's fairly balanced between the two? Or are we looking to simulate something that happened either in real life or in some sort of story, and trying to get the feel of that world and experience it to some degree within that context? I don't think that those things are completely mutually exclusive. I think you could make arguments that we try to achieve both at times in wargaming. But I think as well, and I don't think I don't think balance and simulation directly relate to this, but I think there is relation to predictability versus unpredictability too. When you're doing something and you're simulating something, you could make the argument that you're trying to make it more predictable. But then with balance, you're also trying to make things more predictable from the perspective of how one group relates to the next, as far as like your one army relates to the other one, as far as its opportunity. And so then also, you could be making things more unpredictable as well with both of those situations, I think, too. So it's interesting. It's an interesting subject, and I kind of wanted to bring it up just a little bit to see what other people thought about it and how it relates to their wargaming. It's funny because getting back to the 40K example, and I have some miniatures in front of me here, and these are some of my Space Marines. I have a captain and 2 Space Marines, and then I have the Eldar avatar that I had painted. And I remember reading in the Horus Heresy, and I remember the Primarch. For those of you that don't know 40K, but he's sort of a superhuman son of the Emperor, that leads a whole chapter of Space Marines. Well, Fulgrim, who's one of the Primarchs, I remember reading, and I'll try to get this right because it was years ago, but essentially he went through this big Eldar construct called a Wraith Lord, almost like it was butter, and then went on to then beat down and destroy an actual avatar, which is a statue with really the essence of Cain, a god, in it. And the avatar did give him a bit more of a run for his money, but he pretty much went through him, and he just got burned to pieces, because the actual avatar is like filled with molten lava and iron, and this character who's still destroyed it, but was just burnt up. And then I believe Eldrad, who's like the #1 Farseer, which is like a wizard for Eldar in the universe of 40K, basically fled, at that point. And so that was Fulgrim also like being possessed by a demon. I realize I'm throwing a lot of terminology around here and everything. For those of you that have read it, you know what I'm talking about. But I remember coming away from that and thinking, gosh, like, why even play Eldar? Really, like, a Primarch can just come through and just wipe, them all out really single-handedly. And it just makes you just think about, like, the game and just, like, is that the way it would happen in the game? Or, and I guess for the space, at the time, I was thinking of it from an Eldar perspective, but if you're a Space Marine player, you may actually play the game at that point and even use the Forge World Fulgrim model. And, you may or may not be able to achieve really, like, the way he was able to do that in the book, and you might feel a little down about it, like, just depending on how it goes. So I just kind of thought it's an interesting subject. Now that I'm actually entering the comic wargaming again, I'm planning on playing the Marvel Universe game, it made me think about this a lot, because you could virtually say, like, if you're using the Hulk in Marvel, you could play it in such a way that it's almost impossible to win against the Hulk. And depending on the kind of game you like, you might say, well, that's just fine. Or you might say, well, this just stinks. Like, why would I want to sit down and play a game with you and paint up my stuff if you're just going to beat me over the head with the Hulk each time? And, like, I was kind of thinking about that a lot, because it's really hard, like, in comic books, for those of you that have been into comic books at any point in your life, you'll know that writers misrepresent, or I should say they represent characters differently over time. They may either misrepresent the original character and the way it was originally done, or it evolves. But either way, different writers at times represent the same character differently. And sometimes it purely is just at what point are you reading this comic book and who's writing it and what's happening at that time, but that character is not the exact same character as you had, saw before. So that makes it really difficult to standardize characters across a game universe when they're changing even within the narrative quite a bit. But it does make it kind of interesting because you might see things happen that just you'll never see potentially happen in the comic just because it's the roll of the dice and it's actually more of a balanced game that we're trying to create and less about a simulation. Now, in some ways, particularly since I'm planning on playing a lot of this Marvel game solo, and having it on the channel, not as much, I'm not really planning on building a group here and locally at all for it. I'm actually fine with an unbalanced game. I'd be fine with a really hard game to just try even survive or contain the Hulk, just as an example. And some of you, I'm not a game designer expert or even very versed in game design. I know there are a lot of good videos that are coming out on game design. Even some people within our community are putting them out. But if you think back to video games, depending on the kind of video games you play, a lot of them, because it's not a two-player game sometimes, it's actually solo, you against the game itself. Oftentimes that would be characterized, I think, as unbalanced because, as you go up in level, it's supposed to be difficult for you to keep going on. And, being a kid of the 80s, I played games that just seemed like impossibly hard as you would go up. And forget the fact that you could, if you just paused for a second, you'd die. If you didn't turn right or left at just the right time, you'd die when you get to certain levels. That's the idea of it, is to actually try to achieve a very hard task, and it gets more impossible and more impossible as the levels go on. So is that fun? Obviously I think it is for some, because it's quite popular in certain things. You generally don't see two-player games where they make it extremely easy for one and very hard for the other, because it just isn't usually fun, or fair for the one that actually has the easier experience. I guess the question is whether in wargaming is there a place for trying to play a narrative style where you truly are accepting a large amount of imbalance, but that it's still part of the fun of it. And I guess we sometimes see it in scenarios where you might have your scenario balance the situation. So it's funny, I don't play Age of Sigmar, but I remember when it was coming out, if you took way more miniatures than your opponent, then immediately they gave you the ability to win the game if you just achieved an objective. And so you might even say, and going back to the Marvel situation, you have the Hulk on the table, and then you have some team, the X-Men, and they're trying to contain the Hulk, and he's getting madder and madder. And truly it might be, instead of beating the Hulk, you're doing something just to contain him, to stop him, to prevent other people from getting killed, preventing mass destruction, could be the result. Whereas for him, it's defeating the whole team and within a certain number of rounds, or something to that effect. And so I find that interesting to try to think of it that way. It's interesting because I will go over the rules for the Marvel Universe game when it comes out, and it is supposed to be scenario based. I would even consider house ruling and doing some things differently just to make it a bit more narrative style for fun as well, just to see how that goes. But I guess I would ask you guys, what do you think, how do you enjoy your games? Are you more of a competitive player where you want the game to be as balanced as possible? You're playing as another human opponent. You truly want to see whether you can win, and you want to do that under the most ideal conditions. Or are you more about immersing yourself into the background of the game while playing and trying to enjoy it and see it unfold? Do you like the what-if aspect where anything can happen, even maybe what you don't expect? Or would you rather the story kind of unfold the way you would expect with slight curveballs and differences that happen due to the randomness of the game, but still feeling as if it's happening in the right universe, and at the end of the day, the sun is still setting on your world that you like, whether that be real history or whatever, and things are tending to go in that direction. Okay, well, here's another one of my rambles for Inquisitorial Thoughts, and I hope you guys are having a good one. Take care.